Well, I'm really excited to introduce Daniel Elizalde. We got to know each other speaking at large product conferences, and he's one of my favorite product people. Always a pleasure to talk with him. He is currently VP and head of IoT product management at Ericsson. Before that, he was very active as an IoT product management coach. As I mentioned, he's a speaker. He also teaches classes. He's taught at Stanford Continuing Studies, and he has his own online class. Before that, he's a product leader at several startups. Again, his Twitter handle is @DELizalde, and his website is his name, danielelizalde.com. If you want to check out stuff, he's got a free newsletter that's great if you want to opt in for that. And Daniel's going to be talking to us today about how to drive product innovation with emerging technologies. He's an expert in that field. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. Really appreciate you sharing advice. I love the focus on kind of customer needs instead of the technologies and the whole solution. So yeah, so we'll transition to our fireside chat now. You obviously work with a lot of these emerging technologies. I'm just curious, out of all the various emerging technologies, if you had to place a bet, which ones do you think have the largest potential?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think potential can be tricky, right? Because each of these technologies serves a different purpose, and so for a particular vertical and for a particular application, a particular technology might have more potential. Right? If, for example, if you need a lot of data transfer and the thing moves and you need a low latency, then 5G has a ton of potential. But if you're going to be doing a Fitbit kind of thing that goes indoors, then Wi-Fi is fine, right? So it's hard to say. But if I had to make a bet, I would say that AI and machine learning have a lot of potential, because if you think about all the other technologies that I mentioned, their focus is either to produce data, to move data around, or to present a lot of data. If you think about it, augmented reality, virtual reality. But you still need to do that processing to get those insights, because that raw data means nothing. And so in all those contexts, that processing of enormous amount of data through ML or AI, I think it's going to be more prevalent. I don't know if it has more potential, but it's going to be more prevalent in all solutions.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So you can view some of these technologies are adding additional data that we don't have today. There's like a different layers in the stack. And then you're saying that AI and ML live at a higher level that leverages the data to actually extract the insights, so therefore might be more valuable.
Yeah, because ultimately the insights is what the insights, so that business people can make decisions. That is the goal of the systems, right? So if you have all the data that you want, but you can't really get the insights, then it's pointless.
Okay, great, awesome. And then another one related to this is you do spend a lot of time working with emerging technologies. I think a lot of people are familiar with the ones that you mentioned: IoT, 5G, AI, edge computing. Since you're in this great position, when you look over the horizon, are there other ones that you're starting to hear about that should be on our radar?
There are, but the problem is that these ones that I'm talking about, they're still not here yet, right? So take 5G for example. 5G is real, it's here, there's a lot of deployments, but still we're building the infrastructure to be there. And so 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we'll have full coverage, different story, right? AI is still complicated, and it's still, it's one of the hardest professions to hire for, data scientists, right? Because there's not enough. So yes, you can talk about, quantum computing, and it's yeah, sure, but it's like, we're not there yet, right? It's like right now we're getting to actually see the reality of the things that I was told were going to be here 10 years ago.
Right.
And that's the reality.
Yeah, no, it reminds me, people talk about mobile's coming for the longest time. You're like, okay, we had our little phones. And I guess it's like, I guess that makes sense that these are the technologies where, we're aware of them and we kind of understand them, but they haven't hit mainstream full-scale deployment yet, pervasively, I guess.
Pervasively, right? And so that's why I'm very adamant about the evangelization of this topic, because this is where our profession is going, right? There are not that many PMs right now that actually focus on this kind of stuff, but that is what's going to take for us when this becomes the new normal a few years from now. And I've seen it more, right? I've been talking about this for a few years now, and we see it more and more and more. And so I think this is going to become the new normal, and we need to be able to extract the value, work with engineering teams, work with data science teams, and have a more distributed system-based approach to our products, because that's just how the state-of-the-art technology is today and will continue to be.
Right. That reminds me, going back to the crossing the chasm curve, when you do the cumulative version, it becomes like an S curve. And so each of these technologies is on that same adoption curve, and none of them have hit back to the thing, none of them have hit the mainstream per se, I guess. Yeah, they're kind of in the early adopter phase, right?
They are. So we need to jump that chasm. And now it's funny because IoT has been one of my main focus for years. And the saying was always, well, by 2020, we're going to have this many billions of devices, and then, January 1st, 2020 came, and the first thing you see is like, by 2030, we're going to have this billion of devices.
Yeah.
So the same with, like, you think about it as a vehicle. And that's why I think the crawl, walk, run. I have a 9-month-old baby, and I'm like, she's kind of crawling, she's kind of, it's very important, right? Because I mentioned this example of a drone that's autonomous, flying through the air, looking at the power lines, streaming data. Yeah, sure. But that's like run a marathon. Let's start by maybe flying a drone manually that has a hard drive, and then you bring it home and you analyze it on Excel. And it's like, what is the first step that can do that demonstration of value? And then what's the next level of automation that the customer is still willing to pay? You might find that where the boundary is in the walk. The run is just an engineering optimization that nobody cares to pay for. Right? And we are all guilty about trying to go to that because the technology can-ish. When you try to do it, it's actually a lot harder, but that's where our minds go.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Okay. Well, I'm just curious, what are some of the top challenges that you see product teams running into when they're working with emerging technologies?
I think there's 2 parts. I think one of them is pressure from leadership to do something with this emerging technology. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where it's like, our strategy is AI. And I once had a CEO tell me, it's like, can you help us build an IoT? And it's like, do you really know what you're talking about? And so there's this pressure to use that. And sometimes, we give in and we try putting it in, but it really doesn't make sense, right? So being able to articulate, what is it that you're trying to get at? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And therefore, is this a good solution? I mean, that's what you teach all the time. And it is extremely hard because there's this whole machinery that's telling us that what you can do with these technologies, but those 2 things don't align. So I think the first is to resist that perspective and focus on the customer. But then the second one is, okay, let's say that you can actually use these technologies. The path, like I said, to MVP and scalable solution is way more complex and with much more moving parts. And I've seen product managers are not equipped with the tools to actually manage software, hardware, embedded connectivity, partners, security, privacy, ethics, right? So it's a much bigger spectrum. So I think we're getting better at it, but we will have to evolve quickly.
No, that makes sense. The first part, it's like, you get the executives that's like, oh my gosh, IoT is a hot new thing, or chatbots. What's our chatbot strategy? We need a chatbot. Like, we need an X. We don't want to miss out. We don't want to miss out. We're the one company that on Investor Day, they ask us what our IoT strategy is, and we don't have an answer. So it's a hammer looking for a nail, kind of.
All the time. And it's easy to go into that path. And one of the challenges that I've seen here is that, take IoT, right? You have all these components that I presented. It is very expensive to create an IoT solution. And so if you have a mega hammer that's going to take and find no solution and find no problem to solve, you just wasted a lot of time and money for nothing. It's not like I see some of the more traditional PM advice that we get is that, well, you put up a landing page and see if there's interest. It's like, that's okay, but at some point you're actually going to have to retrofit a robot with 5G and let it roam autonomously so you can actually see if you can get it done. That costs a lot.
Right. No, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And on the second part, you're right. As PMs who just work in software SaaS alone, we're already spread thin across so many areas and having to work with so many partners. And you're right that now with these solutions, you've got hardware, software, ecosystems, partners. It's even more to manage on someone's plate.
It is, and I think that's where the role of the head of product, it becomes even more important, because then you need to have PMs that know how to manage those different complexities. And I know there's a lot of advisors like, well, you focus on the customer problem, but at the same time, these disciplines are so different. Putting hardware to market is so different than networking stuff, that is so different to cloud stuff, that you need a team of PMs and work together. And so the head of PM becomes that glue that hopefully has a little bit of experience on all the pieces, or knows who to ask, right?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, the head of PM, because then you're going to specialize your PMs, and maybe you have a hardware PM and a software PM. Instead of trying to have horizontal PMs, the head of the product team is the one that kind of figures out how to organize the team for the work. Then that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And oftentimes, what I've seen, if I can add, is that the PM that has a specific area a lot of their work might be project management of contractors or agencies or specialized development teams that you normally wouldn't have in-house, because you need to solve this particular piece, right? So it's an interesting challenge. And,
yeah, cool. Okay. And then I love your advice about, you stated it so crisply, start with a single use case for a single industry vertical. That's very consistent with Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1. He makes a strong case for that with many examples. And I know a lot of people know that's what they should do. I often see a lot of companies that they see several promising use cases or verticals, and they really have a hard time prioritizing and picking one. So what advice would you give, product teams or companies that are in that boat? How should they figure out which one they should focus on?
It's a really good question. And we struggle, especially at a big company, because you feel you can throw in more resources, right? But my opinion is, or my experience has been, there's some market intelligence that tells you a little bit about the market size, and that's just the very, very beginning, right? I think that the way to choose one is to understand, if you have 3 to choose from, which one do you have a better advantage to get to discover the pains faster. And oftentimes it could be like, well, there's more opportunity, I'm going to say, in the warehousing monitoring business as opposed to in the manufacturing business. But we happen to have 3 people that come from manufacturing that knows a lot of executives that can connect us with them for discovery. Okay, that alone says, okay, well, we have something to start with, right? And so I think, what do you have to do? Do we know partners or system integrators in that particular vertical that we can start with, right? Or our technology is more likely to be more advanced or more differentiated in here. So that's where you start. And the key is clear criteria, so that, okay, enough discovery there, they didn't pan out, okay, back out and look at the next one and the next one and the next one. Right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Which is also very challenging. A lot of companies just like, we got to make this one work, and they just go all out, right?
Right, got it. Okay, so yeah, let's transition then to, when you think about these, it's more challenging of a product management job, like what skills are most important if you're a product manager that's working on emerging technologies, would you say?
I think a lot of people ask me, so it's like, should I learn AI? Should I learn modeling? Should I learn? It's like, yeah, you can. You need to be conversant with your engineering team, but our goal is to focus on the business value. So that needs to be solid. So we need to understand the value of the technology, but the rest of our PM skills need to be very strong. And one that I've seen specifically for this kind of technologies is systems thinking, because you are going to need to have multiple different pieces. Each one could be its own product, but they all need to work together to provide a cohesive experience. And so that ability to break things apart and manage those workflows in all these pieces orchestrated together, right? Because all these emerging technologies that I mentioned, they are, the epitome of distributed computing. And so you have to think about it like that. And so I think that's a good skill for us to have. And in innovation, in terms of lean in terms of discovery is extremely important, because you need to do this work in emerging technologies because nobody really has done it. So you can't rely on a lot of other companies' reports. So you have to have that skill to know whether there's a there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And then I guess related to that, we've been in product management for a while. It seems like in the last several years, it's taken off like a rocket ship, right? Everybody wants a PM. There's more PMs. Everybody wants a PM. So what are some of the top trends that you're seeing in the field of product management today?
I think one of the first trends is I see more growth in the product profession, which is great. A trend I like is that we're seeing more emphasis on things that are extremely important, but that might not be as trivial to think about when you're just learning PM, which is focus on security, focus on privacy, because all these emerging technologies have this relationship with the real world, right? They control physical things, or they manage a lot of data. So there's like privacy and ethics things. So those topics are starting to surface, and I see PM starting to say, well, what about this, right? And the other trend that is lagging a lot, but it's starting to, is sustainability. What will be the impact of our product in the environment? How can we make it less, power hungry or recyclable or cheaper to install and remove and discard? So I'm starting to see that, and I'm a big advocate of that part. But the energy consumption, at least, is starting to play part with a sustainability focus, not only a cost focus. We're far from it, but some interesting trends, right?
Yeah. A couple of people will get to their questions. They're asking about how can I up level my skills. I know you teach courses on IoT product management. Can you just give people a quick overview so they can learn more about it?
Yeah, sure. So I've been teaching for a while now at Stanford and in my own online course, and I really teach a framework on how to think about all these things, because in reality, it's the same techniques that we know as product managers, right? That I come to Dan for advice on the same things. It's just a matter of how do you put them together on a much broader product when you have all these different components and you have to orchestrate UX concerns, not only from the end user, but also from the operations part and the installation part and the maintenance part. And you have business modeling constraints, and you have security constraints, and you have regulation constraint, right? If you're in a regulated area. So it's how do you think about all those things, and how can you drive a roadmap based on that understanding?
Got it. Okay. And that's online course, right?
Yeah, that's my online course. It's on my website. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, great. Sounds great. And I'm just curious, since you've taught a lot of people there and also at Stanford continuing studies, I know as a teacher myself, sometimes you learn, like you get surprised. There's like some surprise. What are some of the surprising things you've learned or seen from teaching people in your courses?
Yeah, so many. I think one of the things that surprised me the most is to see who comes to these courses, because we tend to think, especially here in Silicon Valley, right? We tend to think about the Googles and the Facebooks as almighty. And it turns out that my classes have a lot of people from Amazon and Oracle and Google that they're trying to figure out, just like the rest of us, right? They might be more advanced in some parts, but not in others. Right. And I also get people that are wanting to transition to PM all the way to like senior executives. And so it just tells you that we're all trying to figure it out. And one of the things that I've heard that my courses have helped the most is just to provide a shared language that people can relate to and say, this is what we're talking about, at least, is the first step. Right? So it's been interesting to see like who comes to the classes, and the aha moments of it's like, oh, so that's what it really means. It's like, yeah, it's not rocket science. It's just more mini rocket science thingies.
Right. Cool. Well, I see again, Marcus, who went to your class in 2017, is on here. And then Nick Manning just chatted. I've attended Daniel's PM IoT course at Stanford, and it was an amazing course. So anyway, awesome, cool.
Oh,
all right.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you, Mark. Good to see you guys.
Harsha said, me too. So anyway, with that, why don't we transition to the audience Q&A? So thank you for everyone who's been chatting the questions in chat. If you saw my eyes looking over here, that's because I'm trying to get the questions ready while Daniel's giving us his great advice. So so for this part, I will call out your name, and then if you could just unmute your mic and video, feel free to hop in and you can have a direct conversation. So I think Daniel had a question on machine learning skills that several other people said +1. So Daniel, if you're there, he's there. There he is. Cool. Has to unmute. Okay, I just said cool. So you feel free to hop in here, and you can turn your video on if you want to.
Sure.
And then,
can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. So Daniel, I was just wondering regarding upskilling for machine learning jobs or developing products from the ground up built around machine learning or that incorporate machine learning as a part of their feature set. If you recommend any specific courses to upskill in that area? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two aspects. So great question, and that's an awesome background, though. A couple of things that I've noticed is that it's a lot of people tend to dive into the engineering aspects of machine learning and AI, and it's good to at least know the basics of how it works. But it's more important about how do you work with a ML and AI team? How do they work? What is their process? And so, because building those features and functionality is very different than traditional development. And so understanding how that process works. And so there are some courses on AI product management that actually I know Adnan is the developer of that. He actually was in one of my Stanford courses, and now he teaches AI for product managers at Stanford as well. So that's a really interesting perspective because this is the business of AI from a product perspective. So we can share the link there. And there's so many, right? And just like everything else, it's not just a one-off. It's read as much as you can, read as many books and everything you can. The main advice is don't let that portion obscure the core PM knowledge that you need to have, which is understanding users, business modeling, discovery, right? Because otherwise you're slump-sided. It's better to partner with the people with that expertise and together to drive it forward, because that's what the PMs bring to the table. Does that
Thank you very much.
Great. Daniel, thanks for asking your question, and great name. We have 3 Daniels here together. It's all good. And then next up, Digant, are you there to ask your question?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to chat with you. So I'm kind of curious, what are some methods you use to validate solutions when you're talking to customers, especially when there's complex emerging technologies involved? Do you focus on looks like prototypes to help them envision what the value proposition experience is like? And do you have any use cases, case studies or methods that you've used in the past to sort of do customer discovery when it comes to emerging?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do, there's 2 sides that I usually do. I do the discovery from the understanding if the solution is going to be a fit. And I do prototypes, and I really like the idea of the Wizard of Oz prototyping. Are you familiar with that? Where you simulate something. So for example, we've done this in the past where you have this system that is going to be acquiring satellite images and sending them through 5G into the cloud to post-processing and give you some results. Well, we just mock up the results and we assume that the data will be getting there, because ultimately that insight is what the customer will pay for, right? And they assume that you'll be able to get the rest. And so just focusing on what is the piece that you want to demonstrate or validate, and then the rest can be mocked up. At some point, you're going to have to put it together and make sure that it works. And that's where the second work stream I work with my teams, which is the business model viability. What is the cost of providing that service with the partners? Is their willingness to pay? Is the business model going to work for you and your company? We test that separately, and they say, assuming that this works and it provides you the value, let's talk about the business model, right? So I try those 2 at the same time usually.
And when it comes to pricing methods, are there specific methods you use? there's like Van Westendorp and monadic price testing and all kinds of different things. Have you found something? And obviously it depends on the business model you're talking about, right? But
yeah, it depends on the business model. I think it's more about, to me, the discovery of willingness to pay. I try to focus my teams on, can we quantify the pain of the customer? And there's a rule of thumb that, usually you can price a product around 10% of the pain, right? So if the pain is costing, like in my example of stealing, is costing them $1 million a month, well, maybe they'll pay for a solution for $100K a month, right? So there's just rule of thumbs, but the key is, can you do the discovery to understand how big of a pain is it? Because sometimes the customer says, yeah, this is my biggest pain, but when you dig deeper, it's like, is it a $5 pain or is it a $5 million pain? And from there, right?
got it. Okay.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for your question.
All right.
All right. So next up, Harsha, you had 2 questions. If you want to jump in.
Harsha always has the tough questions, so I'm ready,
No.
Harsha.
No.
And another great background. Look at that.
That's the Star Trek Discovery.
We might have a few sci-fi fans on here.
Yeah. Hello again, Daniel. So I have a 2-part question. What exactly is the difference between an emerging tech product and an emerging tech solution? And my second question is, I was very interested in the crossing the chasm graph you said, and how design thinking, was put in the chasm. And then also you mentioned systems thinking. So I'd like to get a perspective of how maybe design thinking and systems thinking come together, and how can we think in that mode?
Yeah. So I'll answer your second question because I already forgot the first one. You'll have to remind me.
Okay.
But the second question. So I think design thinking and system thinking have to go together. What I take out of design thinking is really that empathy towards the user and willingness to do that discovery. And then you apply that to a system. You have to do the discovery at the multiple levels of the system to understand what are the challenges and who are the users and their pains in the different parts of the system. So it's just the empathy and the discovery. Now you have to apply it more. But then that's where design thinking kicks back again, because when you put it together, it has to feel like a single product. It has to feel like a unity, right? And so it doesn't feel disjointed. So those are how I would kind of open it up and then tighten it out again. And then I think I remember your first question, which is the difference of a product versus a solution. Is that the
correct? And you mentioned that. I took a lead from your thing saying that the value should be quantified for the business, right? So I'm just thinking whether there's a real difference between a solution versus a product.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's just semantics and just how I divide it. If you think about like a full stack, each of the components of the stack might be a product, but when you put them together with some services, that might become an actual solution. Because the way I think about the solution is solving the problem of the customer. The product alone might be just a component of what solves the problem. And usually the customer wants the full thing solved. And we're seeing more and more the customer's willingness to say, do it for me, right? It's like, don't offer something for me to do, to know that I need maintenance, provide the maintenance, provide those kind of things, right? And so the farther you can go, then that's why I'm calling a solution. But again, it's semantics. And I think the most important part is what is the best way that you can represent those concepts to resonate with your company so that you can get the points across, right?
All right, thank you.
Great seeing you.
All right, thanks for your question, Harsha. So next up we have Farai. I think Farai is joining us from Zimbabwe. So Farai, if you could unmute your microphone and camera.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Welcome.
Sorry, I'm trying to get the video to work. It's always nice to. It's working right.
Yeah, we can
It's
see you.
It's actually 3 a.m. So my apologies. So thank you very much, Daniel, for the presentation. I happen to also be involved in quantum computing. So when you were mentioning about emerging tech and you skipped quantum computing the first time, I got deflated, but I got excited when you mentioned it the next time. The problem is it's a futuristic technology, like you were mentioning. How best do you think somebody can sell that technology to the enthusiasts? Because it's not like they're just going to jump on board. I think that would be very useful because I usually have conversations with startups in that area. It may be helpful if you can give me pointers on how best you can present that to the enthusiasts themselves, because sometimes they're just not going to come on board so readily. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reason I left quantum computing out is because it's a little bit farther out than some of the others that I mentioned, right? It's like Horizon 7, right? If you feel that McKinsey Horizons, right? And I think that for all emerging technology, it's about understanding the customer pains and then articulating what is the value of this particular technology. So as I mentioned in my slides, with quantum computer, you can process enormous amounts of information. And so if the problem that the customer is trying to solve is so big that it would require so much computing that you can't realistically do it with normal types of computing at a reasonable price, then you have an in, because now you've identified that pain. And then you can say, okay, well, either you build your own data center or you use a quantum computing machine, right? But unless you can target to that specific pain of who would benefit from that to actually try it out because they're solving a business problem, that's the key for you, is to be able to articulate that value based on the understanding of their pains, if that makes sense.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us at 3 a.m. from Zimbabwe.
Yes.
That's amazing.
I'm a fan. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Farai. Okay, great. And then next up, we have Nick. Nick, who also took your class, it sounds like.
Yeah, I took that a couple years ago at Stanford University. Nice to see you again.
Hey, Nick, what's going on?
My question's around like reports, tools, insights, like Gartner's hype cycles. Like, how does that play into this? We fortunately, I work at Stanford and we have a license to Gartner, and I'm always poking around and looking at those things. And I just curious, like outside of our context and in academic setting, is that a practical thing that people use in this case and that kind of thing? And how do you use it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And they are very valuable in the beginning of the journey. And so I think that when companies are trying to figure out, should we go into this area? Should we go into that area? Is there some business to be had? That's where those reports become very valuable, because those companies, Gartner and Transform, some of the core that I'm sure you're familiar with, have done that legwork for us. And so you can see, okay, if I get this report, I can see that the market is going to be this big in this area and this big for this particular application. And that's a start. I think that the challenge that I see with that is that many companies take that as the gospel and they say, oh, Gartner says that the energy efficiency market in small buildings is going to be $1 trillion. Let's bet on it and build everything for that. But the leap between what a market report says and what a customer really will buy is huge. And that's where discovery and product management really fills in that gap. So I think it's just going back to a previous question, it points you, and if you had to choose between several areas, it gives you some starting info, but it doesn't overrule your strategy and your need for actual discovery. That's how I see it. And a lot of companies follow them blindly and spend a lot of money on that. And I've seen that too much.
So it is a common thing, even at the very beginning, for organizations to invest in that, or at least the preliminary research and planning. And very cool.
Mm-hmm. And it should be, it's a tool to inform your strategy. It's not your strategy. And that's what I think a lot of companies that trap. And I've been guilty of that many times.
Thank you. Sounds
Thank
great.
you.
And
Good.
nice seeing you again.
All right, thanks, Nick, for your question. Appreciate it. Okay, next up we have Marcus, who took your class as well.
Oh man, it's a reunion. That's awesome.
Yeah, Marcus, if you can, there you go.
Yeah, hi. Actually, it was a question for you, Dan Olsen.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, I really found value in your multi-layer pyramid model.
Yes.
But the way you take the vertical slice, I just thought maybe either one of you would mind make a few comments about how applying that vertical slice model to IoT would help.
Yeah, why don't I pull it up and then I'll let Daniel answer it. I'll just put the framework up so people know what we're talking about. And actually this framework comes from our speaker 2 months ago, which is Aaron Walter, who wrote Designing for Emotion. And let me pull it up about talking about MVP. So, and then, okay,
and then, Dan, maybe we can also put in the comments or send them later. I was lucky to have you in my podcast, and we actually discussed that in a lot more
That's
detail.
right. That's right. That's right.
You can share that as well as for further reference.
All right, let me share.
Just let us know which particular podcast. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me.
We can talk about it here if you want.
Yeah, let me share the screen just so people can see it, and then we'll let Daniel share his thoughts on that. All right, cool. So I think, can people see it now? Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, so the basic idea here, and this again, Aaron Walters spoke here 2 months ago. He wrote the book Designing for Emotion. The second edition just came out 2 months ago. That's why we had him. And he basically wrote one of these kind of pyramids, and then Jesse Passanen, a designer, kind of said, let me just create two of these. And I just kind of modified it a bit. So I want to give those both props. But the idea here is that there's a hierarchy of how functional is a product, how reliable is a product, how usable is a product, and how delightful is it, right? Basically, that's the idea. And basically what happens a lot with MVPs is people use MVP as an excuse to say, hey, they do a subset of functionality here on the left, which is great, but they use MVP as an excuse to say, I know it has bugs, but it's just an MVP. We got to get this thing out. We're behind schedule. We'll fix the bugs later. Or, yeah, I know it would have been great to spend more time on UX design and user testing, but gosh, we're just behind schedule, so we'll do that later, right? And so when you test this, it doesn't do well with customers because it doesn't matter if you have great functionality, if it isn't reliable, if it's usable, it's not going to work. So it's true. We can't build the whole pyramid in one fell swoop. But on the right, it's just trying to say, hey, it's not going to be perfect, but for whatever set of functionality you do build, you want it to be reliable enough and usable enough and delightful enough to test your value proposition. So that's kind of the thing. So I'd love to hear Daniel's thoughts on how this applies to the IoT solution that we were talking about.
Yeah, I think this is a perfect representation, and I agree with Dan. I think the pyramid on the right is the right one we should be focusing on, and that's why I was talking about the prototyping with the Wizard of Oz, because the more we can demonstrate that value without building more, the better, right? So once we know that something has the potential to solve a problem and needs to be built, then that's where the MVP would need to have that slice. And it's super important in IoT to be not only functional, but reliable, because let's say that you're doing an autonomous robot on a factory, and every other day it goes haywire. Or if you're doing a computing analytics model and it doesn't provide the right statistics every time. And so that's why with the emerging tech, you actually need to invest more of your resources to get it to the point where it can actually be reliable, usable, and then delightful. And so that's why the more you can do with mockups and prototypes and Wizard of Oz and all the techniques that Dan teaches and that David Bland teaches and all that, the better, because it's really difficult and expensive to get to that point. So hopefully when you're building that MVP, you have that certainty. At that point, you're testing for something else. You're not testing whether the customer is going to like this, because you're past that. So that's my take on that. And Dan, I would love to hear what you think.
No, I think it's really important. The reliability is really important, because I was thinking that you're showing pictures of drones and things like that. I'm like, well, they kind of crash and they break and they run out of batteries, and like I started my career on nuclear submarine design, where reliability is critical. So it's just kind of funny, and it goes back to your chasm model again. It's like the early bleeding edge adopters, they don't mind if the robot breaks every day. They just, they reboot the server or do whatever to do. They don't mind doing band-aids. It's when you get to the pragmatists, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? This isn't going to work for me. So I think that's huge. And the other thing is, I love that diagram where you string together all the different components of technology. The more components a system has, the more risk there is that something's going to break. And if one thing breaks, the whole thing usually goes down. It's usually a single point of failure kind of a situation. If the 5G goes down, there's no connectivity, none of it works. So yeah, I agree that reliability is especially important for these type of solutions. And it's funny because I guess I hadn't thought about this. For really advanced technologies, and your diagram about technical feasibility made me think about it, is perhaps there's even a fifth layer beneath functional, which is just like technically feasible, right? It's like, is it even technically possible? And that's where the emerging technologies is, when it's finally getting to the point where it's technically possible, you can now start to create functionality out of it, perhaps, so anyway.
And that's a really good point, because as in this type of technology, you don't need this to do with other technologies, but with this kind of thing, you don't know if your company can actually build it, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
That's something that has never done before. So even if everything else works, you have a model, you have desirability, you still might not be able to build it. And that's why it has to be tested and it has to be iterated on to see if it's actually feasible. I've actually been at Ericsson. We've done some projects where the idea was good, it was desirable, we had a business model, and it had to do with some special functionality of 5G, and it was not feasible. That the technology didn't support it at this point. And oftentimes with non-emergent technologies, it's not that common to bump into that anymore.
Yeah, and I love that point from early in your talk about, hey, the main difference between emerging technologies, there's the level of technical risk is like an order of magnitude higher. Because I agree with you, no disrespect to SaaS solutions, but at the end of the day, it's like a database, it's a web app. Of course, there's some technical work that needs to get done, but we've scaled databases to millions of concurrent users. It's been done before. Autonomously flying a drone to inspect power cables, that hasn't been done before, right? So I agree. And if you take a step back, when you're trying to build a new product or a new business, there's a variety, there's different categories of risks. And the risk that I tend to focus on is product market fit risk. It's like, okay, we assume the technology is buildable, and it's really about, does this create value? A lot of the stuff that you talked about. But in some cases in emerging technology, the larger risk is perhaps the technical risk. It's true technical risk where there often isn't in other fields. And so, and what I like to say is, whatever the biggest risk is, that's what you want to try to mitigate first and see, can we do. That's why you get prototypes and proof of concepts, and you eventually get to the point of, okay, we kind of strung together some proof of concept that this will work. And then you're like, okay, cool, we feel comfortable. Now let's go try to assess product market fit, basically.
And it's interesting what the comment that you made, because on testing some of these emerging technologies, you say, let's choose 5G, since that I'm very familiar with that. Let's test some feasibility on 5G. Okay, let's get the 5G development kit and let's connect to the 5G network. There's none, right? There's no kits, there's no devices, the network is not there. So all of a sudden it's like, so how do you actually even test if this is possible, right? So again, that's a different conversation that I'm happy to have with you.
Right. Well, actually, there's a question. So Luda has a question related to that. So Luda, if you want to hop in, and Jin Chuan, I see you raising your hand. If you want to chat me, if you have a question, you want to raise your hand, just chat me. But Luda has the next question. If you want to, there you go. If you want to, there you go.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm struggling with not struggling. I'm trying to create a new product with some emerging technologies. It doesn't include hardware, but it does include some machine learning and facial recognition and emotions and stuff like that. And it takes time to develop such a product. And I'm wondering how you, if it's a B2B product, how you go and present what you have to offer to your potential customers if you don't have an MVP yet? Is it necessary to have an MVP before you start talking about product market fit, or you can start these conversations earlier on in the process?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luda, and I'll take half, and let Dan, I think, can take half as well, which is, I think that you definitely have to talk to your customers early on and show something that will clarify whether this solves their need, and whether if you can make it work, would they buy it, right? And so having that reassurance is super important, because you might finish it from a technology perspective, but there's no market fit to be had. And so the techniques that Dan teaches about how do you get to market fit, can you get some early commitments, and just having this discovery with your customers and saying, what would it take for you to believe me that I can make it work, so that we can advance the conversation, right? And a lot of things that happen that I didn't mention at all, but it's super important. With emerging technologies, usually there's a heavy business development component of the business development folks going out and trying to understand the pain and how the solution would be and how would they buy it and what the offering will be, and then working very closely with the product team to bring it to life. But those conversations need to be happening in parallel, right? Because I think those are two very important risks. And at some point you have some stop signs that say, okay, you know what? There was no market fit, stop everything. Or we couldn't get it to work on the technology, stop everything. But you have to move those two in parallel. And Dan, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. I don't know, Luda, if that gives you some insights.
Yeah, I mean, me and my team are working on a platform to develop a VLE, virtual learning environment for young children. So and it's the very beginning, and there is a lot of concerns, exactly the things that you have described, whether to partner with other companies, whether to buy technologies, whether to develop it on our own, whether like our team is capable of making this happen. So yeah, so all this conversation is great for me.
Good. Yep, and that is the journey, right? One at a time and trying to figure all these things out. It's challenging, but it's worth it if you can get it to work. So.
Yeah, and I would just add on, it's interesting because it can be complicated to come up with, prototypes, right? And things like that. And it makes me think about, the difference between disruptive innovation and incremental innovation, and a lot of people love to overquote the whole, well, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. They would never said a car. And there's so many things wrong with that. Like, why would a customer, we're not, as customers, they're not supposed to tell us solutions. They're supposed to tell us problems. And the problem in that example is speed. And they want to go fast and they want to save time. So that's what you want to discover, is what's the problem, right? So that's an important thing, I think, to get at, is everything Daniel's saying is grounded in a pain point that they have. Now, the interesting thing too is sometimes the true definition of disruptive innovation in my mind is people are perfectly satisfied with how it is today. They don't walk around saying, hey, Daniel, I have a pain point. But what happens is technology can now 10x that, and they don't even know what's possible yet, right? But again, it comes back to that pain, the need. And if the need is speed, and they're happy with the speed today, like we're all happy with 4G today. I mean, of course we'd like it faster, right? But if they don't know what's possible, if they don't know that that's there. But our jobs as product managers to make sure, hey, you know what, speed really matters. And if you can do this faster, it's going to be important. So anyway, that's important. And I think that to the extent testing the actual solutions is harder, because to cobble together a multi-component proof of concept is challenging, then perhaps you can lean more on value prop testing with landing pages and collateral, right? Where you actually say, you hit those pain points with your messaging. So you're really testing more your messaging to verify that, wow, yeah, if you have this workflow or this task that you do, we have some new technology that's going to improve that by like 30%, the speed by 50% or 60%. And you message it that way and you test it with people. That's another way to just validate that you've nailed the pain point right, and that however much you can quantify the benefit that your technology is going to give, you can quantify that and test it with them and see how they react to it. So
I think, and if I can add to that, I think that the other important point is to say, and I mentioned before, right, how big of a pain is it? Because based on the gain, because going back to your example of the car, do you want a 10x faster car at 7x the price? It's like, no, I would want it at 0.5% the price. Oh, okay. Right. And so all of a sudden it's like, yes, this could be so much better, but they don't need that much better because they're not willing to pay that much better. And so either you need to go back to your Gartner report and look at a different market, or rethink the idea, the pricing, the scale, etc. Right? But those are very important things. We assume that people want that level, and then they get sticker shock, and they're like, "Oh, at that price, I'm doing fine. I walk."
Yeah, the price performance is really important, and in general, when you're pushing one dimension or benefit, you can get right into cost trade-offs people don't want to make. You can also run into other trade-offs people don't want to make. And so the example I think of what happens all the time is there's a mantra like faster is always better, no matter what. And like thinner is always better. And so the example I like to give, it's a recent one, is Apple MacBooks Pros. I love my Apple MacBook Pro. It's clear every time they made a new one, it's like thinner, 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 right? And so by making it thinner, what did that mean? Well, they had to get rid of the HDMI cable because it's too fat. They had to get rid of the Ethernet cable. No more hard drive, no more SD card slots. That's all, fine, whatever. Some people complain about that. You have to get the whole adapter. They got rid of the MagSafe power. Now that's something that people people are a little annoyed at because they like the little MagSafe strip because it protected their thing. They pushed it so thin that the traditional keyboard, butterfly keyboard design, wouldn't work anymore. So they went to a new keyboard design. And that's the one that would get debris stuck in it and just stopped working. And you go back to that pyramid that we did, all of a sudden, at the expense of thinness, you lost reliability. I can't even type. And then they tried to fix it in the next gen, and it didn't fix it. And they tried to fix it in the third gen, and they finally put silicone. Anyway, and then now the MacBook 16, which they released last year, they went back to the butterfly mechanism. They realized they had pushed, it's like this much thicker. But they realize, just like you were saying, Daniel, instead of taking speed to the max, you take thinness to the max. At some point, you start trading off against other things that they don't want to make those trade-offs. Consumers don't want to make those trade-offs. So anyway, it's the same risk of an emerging tech enabling some new 10x. Sometimes that by itself, it's great. Sometimes it comes with trade-offs that people don't want to make, or certain parts of the segments of the market don't want to make. All right, cool. So we managed to work in Apple reference. That's great. All right, so Craig Fisk, you had a question. If you want to unmute. Thank you, Luda, for your question. Appreciate it. Craig Fisk, if you want to.
Okay. Yeah.
Join us.
Oh, I can't start the video because the host has stopped it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just sent you a thing. You should be able to start it.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, so my question was just, there seems to be more micro in our micro segmentation that's happening all the time. We have the tools for doing very small tests, very fast tests, and very frequent tests. So my question is for Daniel is, how do you think that affects our ability to focus on, or how we focus on a single segment, quote unquote, in doing a new product development?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Craig. And if I'm understanding correctly, you're talking about focusing on a specific market segment and doing small, quick tests, and how is that beneficial?
Yeah, you could break it down even more, more fine-grained, but there's a point, how do you know what the point is where it's too fine?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always been jealous at some other industries that they can do these super fine-grained tests. Like, I hear some, Google stats that they run 10 experiments in a day, and it's like the stuff that I work with, it's like a fast experiment might take you, a month or more because of all the different components, all the different pieces, and you have to go inside a manufacturing facility and enable something that they stop a production line. So it's a different scale and a different type of problem. So I think to me is having a lot of clarity on what is it that you want to learn out of that experiment. And as long as the learning is significant enough, doesn't matter if you can do it in a day or you can do it in a month, but it will take what it will take. But I think the design experiment to understand what you want to learn, and as Dan mentioned, what are the highest risks, and can we minimize that risk with an experiment? I think I would go more for that metric. And if it takes 3 months, I mean, some of my experiments with my teams sometimes have taken 6 months. And I know that like that's kind of like heresy here in Silicon Valley, but it's just like, this is the kind of stuff we're dealing with, right? And I can't get it wrong because people can die. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a different perspective. There's no right number, but it's just whatever it takes for the learning that you need, right? And then you get better at it and hopefully you can do them faster, but I wouldn't agonize about that, especially with some of the tech we're talking about. And if other people have other experience, I love to learn because I like to make them faster, but can't figure out how.
Cool, thanks.
All right, Craig, great. Thanks for your question. I appreciate it. Okay, I think with that we kind of hit most of the main questions that people had, and I know we're coming up on hour 45. So Daniel, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's been great to hear your talk. Great to do the chat with you, and great to get into some of these questions and have a chance to talk about these issues. So thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you so much, Dan, for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you and exchanging these ideas. So thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for attending and for your questions.